Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, and if you are new here, hi, hello, my name is Jenna and I'd like to do something a bit different here on my channel. So basically I do my makeup for the day or just for fun or whatever, and I like to talk about a true crime case at the same time. So I'm not a makeup artist but I like makeup, I'm not a detective but I'm interested in true crime, put it all together and that is me. I do have a bit of a shorter story for you all today, and that is because I bought a book recently which is Southampton Murder Victims. Oh God, that was so cheery, by Jim Brown, and I thought it'd be really interesting to do a case that is to do with my home city, but obviously I wanted to pick kind of like an older case so nobody watching it would get offended and if they knew them or it was their family. I tried to pick a case that was further back so that this didn't happen. However, the case that I thought I would cover, I tried researching, I tried to find different books, I tried Google searching, I managed to find some articles from different places in the UK, so I knew that it was a widely covered case, but apart from that I couldn't find anything else on it at all. So with that being said, I'll just get on with our shorter story. Before I start though, I would just like to say if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and also hit the subscribe button and subscribe to my channel. That would be amazing. Right, let's get on with it. At around 10 AM on the 29th of May 1935, awful screams were heard and 34-year-old Caroline Dyer was seen rushing out of her home in Sholing, Southampton. She ran as fast as she could to her next door neighbour's house, which was a lady called Annie Kilford. She had a large amount of blood coming from a wound in her head and she was screaming, "Come quickly, help me save my children, he has them in the shed." Screams were then heard coming from the garden shed in the garden of Mrs. Dyer. The next door neighbour, Annie, ran to the shed as quickly as she could, but unfortunately she was unable to open the shed door. Nearby was a window cleaner named Harry Burden and his workmate named Mr. Mattingly. They were working on the same street as Mrs. Dyer's home, and when they heard the screams they rushed to the scene. They dropped everything and just ran towards where the screams were coming from. So Mr. Burden tried to open the door and he struggled for a while and he realised that's because someone was on the inside holding the door shut. Eventually Mr. Burden was able to force the door open, and on the other side of the door was 40-year-old Thomas Dyer, which was Caroline Dyer's husband. Thomas was just covered in blood and he had a hammer in his hand. When the door was opened he rushed towards Mr. Burden and he kicked him in the stomach, and as he did this he dropped the hammer that was in his hand. Acting really quickly though, Mr. Burden was able to come to his feet after being kicked, and he punched Thomas in the jaw, which knocked him to the ground. Inside the shed was just a horrific scene. There were 3 young children all covered in blood with really bad head injuries. These children were 6-year-old Frederick Dyer, 4-year-old Iris Dyer and their cousin 3-year-old George Rowe. Little George was laying on the floor underneath a bicycle and he had blood pouring out of a wound in his head, and he was by far the worst injured out of all of the children. The 2 Dyer children were crouched down in the corner of the shed and they were just screaming in fear. Mr. Burden and Mr. Mattingly immediately got all of the children out of the shed and away to safety. It was at this point that Thomas, who had been hit to the floor, he got up and he started stumbling around, and they noticed that he was semi-conscious and that he had a massive wound to his throat. The 2 men then held Thomas back, or held him down, so that he couldn't run away or that he couldn't hurt himself or hurt anyone else. Shortly after, 2 ambulances arrived at the scene, and 1 ambulance had 2 police officers inside. Now, just a little side note, something that I found quite interesting that I didn't know before was that During this time, the ambulances were controlled by the local fire department, so they had firefighters in them. And this just interested me because, of course, the NHS was founded in 1948, so all I've ever known and all like my parents have ever known and grandparents have ever known is the NHS. And obviously we have ambulances that have paramedics in them, but before the NHS was around, it wasn't a thing. And it's really hard as someone from the UK to comprehend our country and where we live without the NHS. Let's hope it stays forever. In one ambulance was Mrs. Dyer and the 3 children, who were rushed to the Royal Southampton Hospital, where surgeons tried tirelessly to save the children's lives. Thomas Dyer was taken in the second ambulance and he was with the 2 police officers, and unfortunately and frustratingly he died on the way to the hospital. I always find it frustrating in these kind of cases that they don't live to, be punished for what they've done. And they leave so many questions unanswered. The family will never know why he really did what he did. The local Southern Daily Echo found out about this and rushed to the scene and was there within just half an hour of the incident happening. That is quick. The reporter wrote in his article, "When I arrived, I saw a pathetic little figure standing at the door of the Dyer home. His eyes were filled with tears and he was inconsolable. He was 9-year-old Tommy Dyer, the eldest of the Dyer's 3 children. When his father seized the other 3 children, he also attempted to push Tommy into the shed, but Tommy, luckily for him, eluded his father, ran as hard as he could from the house and hid in some bushes in an adjoining field. Kindly, neighbours were endeavouring to coax Tommy away from his tragic home, but they could not prevail upon him to leave. While I was talking to him, another pathetic figure came stumbling down Butts Road, half fainting and pushing a pram in which was a baby only a few months old. She was Mrs. Maud Rowe, the mother of George Rowe, the most critically injured of the children. She and her husband, Mr. George Rowe, rented 2 rooms at the house with their 2 children, and she is the sister of Mrs. Dyer." A long time after this had all taken place, the interviewer also interviewed Mrs. Dyer, and she said, "Tom told me at breakfast he was going to mend one of the children's boots. When I was washing up the breakfast things, I told him that if he started the mending job, I would get the children tidy so that when the boots were finished, they could all go out. Tom went to the shed to get the hammer he used for boot mending. When he came back, I was putting the crockery on the dresser, when he came up behind me and hit me on the head with the hammer. Then he dashed into the cupboard. I suppose he got the razor then. I think I must have collapsed." Sadly, the next morning at 11:30 a.m, George Rowe passed away. The causes of death were listed as shock, multiple depressed fractures to the skull, and loss of blood. Poor little George had a total of 8 wounds to his head. On the 31st of May 1935, an inquest was opened into both the deaths of Thomas Dyer and of George Rowe. When interviewed, the brother of Thomas Dyer, named Harry Dyer, said that he had seen his brother last on the 27th of May, which was 2 days before the incident. He said that Thomas's general health was quite poor, and that he had actually suffered from stomach ulcers for the past 2 years, and he was also unemployed and had been so for the past 7 months, and he said that all of this was taking its toll on Thomas. He also said that Thomas was actually a good husband and a devoted father, and he was always kind and caring and devoted to his children, and he was a loving husband, and that Thomas and Caroline had been in love for years. He said, however, that Thomas was just growing more and more ill in his body and in his mind, particularly the last week running up to the incident. The inquest actually had to be stopped and postponed until the 27th of June, which is nearly a month later, and this is because Caroline Dyer, the mother and the wife, was just too ill to go to court and give evidence, and her children were still in quite a bad way in hospital. So when the case was adjourned, Mrs. Dyer was able to give her evidence in court. She said that her husband seemed really depressed and not himself for a few weeks running up to the incident, and that she had even sent for her doctor, who came to see Thomas and said that he was just out of sorts, he needed to rest, but if he got any worse, that Caroline Dyer should send for him again. Mrs. Dyer then explained that the night before the incident, Thomas was really restless, he couldn't sleep, and he spent the majority of the night just wandering around the bedroom. The next day, the family had breakfast like usual at 7:30, and after breakfast, Caroline asked her husband Thomas if he felt any better from his restless night. Even though Thomas replied that yes, he did feel better, Caroline didn't really believe that because she could see him trembling, he was physically shaking. At around 10 a.m, Caroline said that Thomas walked into the kitchen and without saying anything, without any expression, any words, he just hit her over the head with a hammer. Amazingly, she managed to turn and run out of the house, but then afterwards she could hear the screams of her children coming from her garden shed. In court, Caroline was asked if her husband had ever had these semi-brainstorms or had any suicide thoughts or threats of suicide, and she said no, he's never acted in any way like this at all before. After hearing all of the evidence, the jury came back and concluded that Thomas Dyer had murdered George Rowe and attempted to murder his 3 children, and then he committed suicide while of unsound mind. Both Thomas Dyer and George Rowe are buried in a cemetery named St Mary's Extra Cemetery, which is not far from where they once lived. It always baffles me in these cases when the mother or the father feels the need to kill their children as well as killing themselves. I always struggle to understand that one, because if you loved your children that much, why would you kill them? I don't really know. What are your thoughts? Let me know in the comment section below. So that's it for the short video today. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry it was a little bit short and not as detailed. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel if you aren't already, and I will see you in next week's video.